Hello and welcome to Checking the Vitals, a podcast powered by SpecialtyCare. I'm Todd Schlosser, and today my guest is Gregg Agoston, the VP of Surgical Services at SpecialtyCare. I feel very lucky to have caught up with Gregg at a convention recently so that we could discuss the silent epidemic that is currently taking place in hospitals across America, what exactly is causing those issues, and what can be done to resolve them. I think you'll also be very interested to hear what he has to say about the rate of surgical site infections and how a sterile processing department, when utilized correctly, can really mitigate those issues. Enjoy the conversation. I like to start off the conversations by asking people what drew them to want to work in a career in healthcare. So do you have a story or a reason that made you passionate to work in this space?
Yeah, so when I graduated from college and was looking at careers, I had a degree in marketing and wanted to get into something that I felt passionate about. And I went on interviews and I talked to a guy that sold meat, like deli meat.
Okay.
And I talked to a company that sold elevators and escalators. And while they were, good, well-known companies, this wasn't any spark. So I started looking and I found a position with a pharmaceutical company. And I thought this was great because I could something in healthcare and I could help people. And so I started my career in pharmaceuticals and I spent 13 years at that, and then decided that I wanted to move over to medical equipment and then move to actual durable equipment after that.
Yeah. And that's sort of what got you into the sterile processing space, I'd imagine?
Yeah, so the first position I had was starting out, actually my older brother, who was worked for American Hospital Supply as a V. Mueller salesperson. He had started some other businesses, and one of the businesses was one that we were doing outsourcing of minimally invasive instruments and supplying technicians. So this was very early on. We were one of the genesis of supplying outside support for hospitals and sterile processing. At the time, endoscopic or laparoscopic procedures, lap chole was really just at the boom, and there was a great need for equipment. There was a great need for technical expertise to manage this, this new video equipment, the cameras, the scopes, and the instruments. And so there was a need at that point where they needed, because of the dangers of having equipment that didn't work properly, having an outside source come in that had expertise with the equipment to help and manage that equipment. So we would do all the functional testing, the repair, the replacement on the equipment, making sure that it was, at 100% for each and every patient. And so there's real value to the patients in that, and I think that through that business we started and was very successful. Eventually Cardinal Health bought us. I stayed with them for a couple years and then moved over to another major endoscopy company. I was with them for 13 years and created programs with them related to SPD. And the thing the common thread through this was that all along I was working in sterile processing departments across the country, and I saw how much many of the departments struggle. Now, not all of them. There's some very, some that are just, things are working very well. But there is a large number of them that have many challenges related to, just maintaining the proper staffing, with the technical expertise in that to manage the equipment.
If you don't mind, can we get into some of what some of those challenges are and those kind of things? So like if you walked into just a regular, not the best, not the worst, what are some very common problems sterile processing unit might face?
There's common threads and common themes. Number one is kind of employee morale and employee turnover. And so that's really related to the pay that the people receive. Very often, it's sad to say, and maybe historically, I'll back up because I think the historical significance of how sterile processing was formed initially is important. So prior to the central sterile processing department being formed, it used to be that most of the operating rooms had their own processing area. The floors in the hospital had their own processing area to do instrumentation. So they were cleaning and sterilizing in the operating room, up on the floors, in the different departments that use instrumentation. From a standardization perspective, it was much better to consolidate that, and they did that by the creation of the sterile processing. So they wanted to have standards, they wanted to make sure that everything was processed consistently, because it's very difficult to manage when it's all scattered throughout the hospital and all these clinics potentially.
Yeah, because it's so spread out. You want to have like a unified center that handles it, I'd imagine.
Plus, from a production standpoint, rather than having all this equipment scattered around and different people doing the different functions, you know, taking it out of the operating room, one, did a couple things. It removed the potential contamination in the operating room area, so that removed that from the patient area.
Sure.
Which was good. It also took the responsibility for cleaning instruments away from the nursing staff. So now the nursing staff could be much more focused on the patients versus the instruments. But what was missed in that, because I think at some points it was seen that by doing that, instrumentation is more of a, like a, you know, spoons and forks. You know? And way back when, you know, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have all the complex instrumentation that we have today. So it was a lot of general stainless steel instrumentation and equipment, but you know, so it wasn't what I would consider complex equipment.
Right, and now they are very complex. I mean, it isn't spoons and forks and dishes. Like it's very complex instruments that you have to get in and really minutely clean them, or you're going to have a lot of issues.
And understanding the equipment is extremely important.
Yeah.
So the challenge is that they took all of the equipment, they brought it into the central sterile department. They brought in staff to clean and to sterilize the equipment. But now you went from a situation where before the nurses were experts with the instruments, because they were actually in the room when the surgeon was using the equipment. They knew the instrumentation. They knew it by name, they knew what it was used for, they knew why it was used, how it was used, they knew what happened when it would fail. So they were expert with the instrumentation. Now you consolidate that into a department, and now you challenge this department with cleaning every single piece of instrumentation in the hospital. So it could be everything from the scopes they use up in the ICU, to instruments in the ICU, to scopes from the GI center, scopes that are used in the operating room, as well as all the power tools and all of the other sophisticated
Da Vinci machines, and that are cleaning those are huge processes. It's not like a 10-minute thing.
And 40 years ago, we didn't have all that complex equipment. Okay, so initially it kind of started out where it made good sense. But the two primary faults, I think, are one is administration really not recognizing the importance of sterile processing overall and the complexity of the equipment as it evolved.
Yeah.
That's a big challenge. So as we did develop into, you know, endoscopic procedures and the cameras and the scopes, and now you're talking things that, you know, a scissor may cost $20 or $30 for a scissor. Some scissors are more, but, you know, there's scissors that may be, you know, $6 or $7 too.
Sure.
You go from a piece of equipment like that to a rigid endoscope that is going to cost, the hospital's going to pay probably $3,500 to $5,000 for these rigid endoscopes. And
you can't just throw them away at the end of every surgery.
Yeah, so that's one scope. A camera is $12,000 to $14,000.
Wow, okay.
You get a flexible endoscope and you're talking $25 to $35. There's some flexible endoscopes that have very sophisticated microscopes and ultrasound units in them that are over $100,000 a piece.
Wow, okay. I had no idea that was the case.
We took all of that equipment, put it in this centralized department, and unfortunately the staff there has been kind of treated like the cleaning department.
Yeah.
Like they're cleaning spoons and forks.
I've heard someone say, that they are looked at as sort of like the dishwashers of the hospital.
Kind of.
Which if you spend 3 minutes in one of those departments, which I was fortunate enough to do, we were able to walk through one. I was blown away by the specialization they have to know for every instrument. It's not like you're putting dishes in a rack and throwing it through a cleaner. It's not like that at all.
No.
Yeah.
So the staff in the sterile processing has got to know what the instrument is.
Yeah.
They've got to know how to disassemble it if it needs to be disassembled. They got to know what steps to go through to properly clean it. And then they've got to, on the other side, they've got to know how to prepare it and inspect it to see if it works properly, package it properly, and then sterilize it. Now, again, with everything coming into, you know, in a large hospital where you've got, you know, 10, 15, 20, 40 ORs, you've got all types of surgical specialties, and the surgeons and the nurses typically are able to specialize to some degree, meaning that orthopedic nurses tend to do orthopedic cases.
Yeah.
The nurses that do the eye procedures typically do the eye procedures. Mm-hmm. But now we took all of that sophisticated equipment and we put it into one department, and we expect the people that come in either from a community college with certification or training in sterile processing, oftentimes people hire the employees off the street and train them internally.
Okay.
Or they hire them from other hospitals typically, or maybe they promote up from, within, maybe coming from, food services within the hospital to move over to sterile processing. The fact of the matter is, many of these people starting pay on average is probably around $11 to $13 an hour to start. Wow. And they're expected to know every single piece of equipment in the hospital.
Yeah.
The other challenge is that because of the way sterile processing is set up, there's really not a specialization in sterile processing in most hospitals. Now, again, I'm speaking in general because some hospitals do have it.
Yeah,
many
in
don't.
Any industry, you're going to have the people who do it well and the people who don't do it well, and a lot of people are in between that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So with one of the roles in the sterile processing department is oftentimes the people just rotate through the different areas. So you can have a very tenured person who may be very well trained and knows the equipment because they've been there for 15, 20 years. And today they're doing the decontamination, and tomorrow they're doing prep and pack, and the next day they're pulling the case carts or pulling the materials to send upstairs to the OR. The next day they're open the GI center. Maybe if they've got some places that sterile processing also process the GI scopes.
Yeah.
So they're exposed to every single instrument in the hospital, and then then if they're doing prep and pack, then they're anything that's sitting there that needs to be packaged, they have to package, whether it's an eye set, an orthopedic set, it's a laparoscopic set, it's you name it.
Anything going on in the hospital, really.
Any instrument in the hospital. And when you consider that a hospital may have 1,500 different instrument sets.
I didn't realize it was that many.
And so there's literally tens of thousands of instruments in a hospital. And we've been in hospitals where in the morning come in and there's 300 to 400 instrument sets just sitting on the shelves waiting to be assembled.
Yeah.
And now it's like, okay, what do I pull?
Yeah.
And so they're going to go pull a tray and they're going to try to assemble it, and they're going off a little menu. Sometimes the menus have pictures, sometimes they don't.
I would imagine they would need to. If you're looking at 15,000 different types of instruments?
It could, I mean, there's thousands.
You could work for hours a day, every day for 3 years and not have seen every one of them.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Well, the fact is that they will see every one of them because they have to see every one of them. The question is, do they recognize them?
Will they remember it?
Do they know what it is, what it's used for, how it's to be assembled,
and probably how to clean it.
Well, I mean, there's separate things. So if you're working in decontamination, you've got to know all that about what do I do to this not to hurt it.
Yeah.
And we see mistakes made. We see common mistakes because people will generally try to do what they think is not going to hurt the equipment. So you kind of get the average of what's supposed to be done. Like, I know I can rinse it off, but I don't know if I can submerge it into water to clean it. So maybe I'll keep it out of the water and just kind of wash it as best I can and kind of gently rinse it because I don't know if I can submerge it to wash it. But the reality is something like that, if it's being hand washed only, then it may not be properly washed. And we see examples of that where instrumentation that's hand washed only comes through and it still has bioburden on it on the quote clean side of sterile processing.
So before you use bioburden again, because this is something that was new to me and I had no idea what it was until maybe our third conversation. So can you go into a little bit of detail of what bioburden actually is?
So bioburden is in essence remnants of the patient that it was just used, that instrument was just used on. Okay. So it's blood, it's tissue, it's body fluids, it's whatever mucus, it's whatever was exposed to that instrument that remains behind.
Yeah.
The reality is that material can contain bacteria, or bacteria can grow on that material if there's moisture available, and it creates a problem. And so soil that's left on an instrument, if it gets mixed with bacteria will set up shop on that location. And these things called biofilms now that are so much in the news is that the bacteria we found are actually much more sophisticated than what we thought. When you went through high school biology and you looked through a microscope and you saw your first bacteria, some little planktonic material growing or moving around in the petri dish on the lens, we now know that those organisms, bacteria, can communicate and they send signals out and they basically colonize an area. If there's food and if there's moisture, they'll try to colonize and they grow very rapidly. Yeah. And once they start to colonize, they also form a shield over themselves. So they put this little covering over top of them called the biofilm, and they live inside that little colony and they communicate and they work symbiotically to perpetuate that colony, whether it's protection or growth and distribution of more bacteria.
So when they're living in this colony, having their heyday, if they don't get properly washed off or cleaned, or the instrument that they're living on doesn't get sanitized correctly because of all these problems that you've sort of laid out, what are the repercussions of that?
So infection is the primary repercussion. So the longer, the key is with instrumentation, and I use this example a lot. So if you have a fried egg, you got your plate and you fried egg and you get some yolk that spills out of the egg and lays on the plate, you know that if you go to wash that, the longer that sits there, that protein material sits there, the harder it is to remove from that.
It can become concrete.
Become concrete. Okay, that's the same thing with the biofilm. Biofilm basically becomes like concrete. It cements itself to the instrument, protects itself from chemicals by the shield that it builds over itself, and it becomes very hard to remove. So the longer the instruments sit after use, before they actually get processed to be cleaned, the worse that is. And now we've got these, again, a scissor is one thing where you can kind of, you got a hinge area, but it's relatively a general instrument, pretty straightforward. When you get to a flexible endoscope that have these long lumens, these channels that can be, 4 or 5 feet long, you've got a brush there, you can't see inside of it, you really don't know if you're removing everything, so it becomes problematic. And unfortunately, we hear and we know of cases that instrumentation that's not been properly cleaned shows up in the operating room, and patients are exposed to this material. Being exposed to it definitely increases the risk of surgical site infections, and that's what all of us need to prevent, because surgical site infections, we know that there's kind of a perfect storm brewing for our population. One is that we've got more elderly people going to demand more surgery. Okay. Two is we know that the bacteria is much more virulent now than it once was, because it's been exposed to chemicals and antibiotics. So it's harder to kill, and we know that resistance of bacteria is increasing. Where now it's not years like when penicillin first came out. It was many years before the first resistance. Now they're literally measuring resistance in weeks and days and shorter periods, because the bacteria has become that much more difficult to kill.
And resilient.
And resilient, And the other thing is we don't have that many new antibiotics coming out. So it becomes extremely important that everybody does everything they can to prevent any type of exposure to material that should not be on an instrument. So technically, if an instrument is not clean, it cannot be considered sterile. And so that's the genesis of, you've got to have people who are really knowledgeable and understand the equipment and properly clean it without doing damage to the instrument, but yet thoroughly cleaning it to remove all of that soil or bio burden.
So, and I realize this is like a world you live in and have lived in for quite some time, and you're sort of an expert at it, but how big is the problem? Is it something that not many hospitals deal with, every hospital deals with, some hospitals deal with? How big is it?
I mean, the reality is that probably on a daily basis in hospitals all across the country, there's instrumentation going into operating rooms that have not been properly cleaned or processed.
So every day in every hospital that's happening?
If it's not every day, it's probably every week.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, it's a silent epidemic. I really believe it's a silent epidemic from what I've seen. When you talk to the nursing staff and you talk to the people, whether or not they see it or not. Now, whether they the nurse may not recognize that there's bioburden on instruments coming into the room.
Because there are some places on those scopes you can't see that.
You can't see it. You don't know. So you're trusting, and what happens is there's a trust. And fortunately, antibiotics and proper procedures, because there's multiple procedures that are done to prevent infection from surgical site infections. But we know that everything else that has surgical site infections over the last, really 10 years since I've been tracking them, really have not decreased.
Oh, wow.
For the types of procedures that
we've only been tracking them for 10 years?
Well, I think it's gone back to like 1992, I think was when they first started, tracking.
So it's relatively recent.
Couple different procedure types, but it's relatively stayed the same. So they're reporting at 73,000 surgical site infections, but that's related only to 2 surgical procedures, so colon procedures and vaginal hysterectomy. So
for 2 different procedures, there were 73,000. Is that since '92?
That's for where they're tracking and recording the information.
That's
no, per year.
Whoa, per year?
Yeah.
So 73,000 per year.
Yeah.
For just 2 types of surgeries.
2 types of surgeries, yeah. And if I do a lot of presentations, and presentations I've been in. One of my first questions is, how many of you in this group either know of someone, either a close friend, relative,
Sure.
acquaintance that has had a surgical site infection? And it's amazing how many hands will go up. I mean, literally at conferences where these people work in sterile processing, half the hands will go up in the room that they know someone. I know personally, a friend of mine was telling me, and his wife works in the operating room at the hospital. He had his surgical procedures. He went in for 2 different procedures, one shoulder, one knee, and both of them developed infections post-op. Now, can we say, is that due to a dirty instrument, or was it due to maybe antibiotics not being given at the right time,
Sure.
or the prep for him, or he was just the unlucky patient? There's multiple factors that go into determining whether or not a patient will have a surgical site infection. Specifically, when it comes back to sterile processing and their role, there's two primary areas that they impact those factors. The first factor is the longer a patient is exposed to the operating room environment, the greater the risk of surgical site infection.
That, yeah.
Okay, so the longer you're in that room, the greater your chances are you're going to get an infection post-op.
Right.
And that's the first one. So how does sterile processing impact that?
Yeah.
One, they impact that by if instrumentation shows up in the room and they open up the instruments and they find that there's something that's missing, broken, or not functioning properly.
Right. They've got to get another setup.
They got to wait, and it delays, and it extends the patient's exposure time.
Gotcha.
The second area is dirty or non-sterile equipment.
Right.
So that's the second function. So if an instrument comes up and it still has bioburden or debris that's on the instrument or in the container, or foreign materials in the container, or if the item wasn't properly processed, then there's a greater risk that equipment is not sterile. So it's always got to be clean to be sterile.
Sure.
But the assumption is when it shows up, it's sterile. And
yeah.
I've literally had surgeons come up to me and ask me, one in particular, I'll never forget. He said, I'm in doing a knee arthroscopy, and I'm seeing little black flakes inside the joint space. Can you tell me what that is? And unfortunately, what that is the instruments that they're using. There's blood that's
from previous surgeries.
From previous surgeries.
Oh man,
that's basically flaking out.
And so that would be that bioburden.
Exactly.
Oh man.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's literally the last patient is on your new patient's knee.
Exactly. Or as many patients that were inside that instrument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so it seems like this problem, if you want to call it that, silent epidemic, if you will, it's multifaceted, and it doesn't seem like there is a silver bullet to fixing it.
Yeah.
But what sort of steps could you take if you were like a hospital manager or OR manager? How could you help isolate this problem and solve it?
Yeah. So I'm very passionate about one thing is that getting sterile processing the recognition for the work that they do and the importance of the work. I mean, I there are different analogies of what sterile processing is. To me, sterile processing is the heart of the operating room.
Yeah.
Okay, because what they pump out, the materials, the instruments, and disposable supplies that they send up to the operating room is the blood.
Yeah.
The operating room may be the brains. They do the procedures, but they can't do their work. The brain dies if it doesn't have blood.
Right.
Okay, so if the equipment doesn't come up, if it's properly prepared, that it's on time, it's available, and it's functional, if it doesn't meet those 3 criteria, then the operating room suffers, and ultimately the patient suffers.
It's almost like safer surgery doesn't start in the surgical OR; it starts in the SPD or the surgical OR.
Absolutely, because that really is the origin of the instrumentation.
Yeah, because if you get bad instruments, you're going to get bad outcomes.
Exactly. Eventually, you're going to end up with bad outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what else can be done to sort of resolve that?
So the resolution for this, in my opinion, is first that the recognition by the leadership of the hospitals of the importance of sterile processing.
Yeah.
We can't bring people into these departments, pay them minimum wage or close to that. I mean, I was at the hospitals in Texas that were saying they're starting people out a little less than $10 an hour.
I mean, you can go work at Chick-fil-A for that.
And that's the problem.
Yeah.
People come in, they'll come in, they'll leave to go to work at a department store, any place that pays more. And unfortunately, sterile processing is not a glamorous position. I mean, we're dealing with contaminated bloody instruments, potentially instruments that carry hepatitis, AIDS virus. So there's danger associated with working with this equipment. You're working in a department typically that doesn't have windows. you're lifting heavy items. You're having to stand over a sink and clean, wash these things all day long, and as your turn rotates through that area.
Yeah.
So it's not glamorous, and oftentimes the people in the operating room then get, the communication from the operating room is not all that positive because they only hear when things are not right.
Right.
And I've literally been in offices of the sterile processing manager when the nurse comes down or a physician comes down, and it is not a pleasant scene because something wasn't set up right. But yet we're tasking the people in sterile processing with an almost, it's like they really can't succeed based upon the parameters that have been set up with sterile processing, because sterile processing has not evolved like the operating room.
Yeah.
The operating room has been allowed to specialize more so than sterile processing. And then when I say that in meetings with people will say, well, we can't specialize. I can't have like one person down in sterile processing who only cleans, because nobody wants to do that. Or I can't have one person who only does the orthopedic sets because we got so many sets coming through and we don't do that many cases a day. That person will be standing there for half the day.
Right.
I understand that. But there is a way that you can designate instrumentation between general instrumentation and complex instruments.
Sort of specialized instrumentation, yeah.
Exactly. So complex instruments are those devices that would be related to like power tools, endoscopes, flexible and rigid, semi-rigid, minimally invasive instruments. And in any key areas in the hospital, that the hospital says, this is like, we do a lot of work in this area, orthopedics maybe. We need a specialist for orthopedics because we've got such high volume.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that that those sets are always put together. Plus, and when you deal in orthopedics, there's a lot of loaner sets that come in. And so literally, manufacturers will bring an instrument set or multiple instrument sets, 10, 15 sets in for one surgical procedure for a patient.
Yeah.
And drop it off the night before and expect the sterile processing department to know all the instrumentation and this equipment that's not even theirs, it's on loan for that particular case. So it is extremely challenging.
Yeah, it sounds like it. How do we get the message out about this silent epidemic that's going on? I was blown away by that 37,000 number that was, and I thought it was all the way from 92, but it was actually from every year.
73,000.
73,000, yeah, and it's just those two types of surgeries. There's so many types of surgeries that go on.
Yeah.
So that means it's exponentially bigger than that.
Yeah, it is exponentially bigger, and the impact to healthcare is billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars from when you consider the extra stay. Typically, people that get a surgical site infection are in the hospital longer. 7 to 11 days longer.
Yeah.
There's all the lost work time, expense, and the reality is it's the impact on the person, because when somebody has a surgical site infection, it is catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's life and death. They've got a much higher rate of death if you get a surgical site infection. People get exposed to antibiotics for months, sometimes even longer, to try to cure these problems. So it takes real toll on the person, on their family, on their economics and finances. So
Absolutely.
It is a major, major issue when that occurs, and unfortunately it occurs too frequently. So that's the whole purpose of why we've got to do everything we can to prevent that from occurring. Again, we know that there's multiple factors that build to surgical site infections, but certainly we know sterile processing plays a role in two major parts of that.
Yeah.
And we know that if the equipment's not properly clean, if it's not functioning properly, if it causes delays in the operating room, surgeon frustration goes up. There's a toll on the staff, toll on the staff and on the surgeon. When you have a surgeon working on a patient, you want them to be totally focused on what they're doing with the patient. You don't want them to be distracted because of an instrument issue.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that occurs frequently. And then it weighs on the surgeons. I was at a conference where a surgeon actually came in and gave a presentation where there was a problem with an instrument in the first case of the day. And then she's thinking, well, was that person, what do I need to do to protect that patient?
Yeah.
And now she's thinking about that patient when she's in with the next patient.
Yeah, so it compounds.
It compounds itself, exactly. And those frustrations build, and surgeons become very, very, very frustrated when they can't get equipment. They expect the equipment to be in the room, be available, be functional, and be clean and sterile for every patient.
Right.
That's what they expect. The reality is, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, and we got to try to fix that.
And if fixing that is going to save billions and billions of dollars, of course, across the country, not for every hospital,
Right.
but if you invest whatever that hospital's portion of that billions and billions of dollars in savings in the SPD,
Yes.
I mean, it may not resolve every issue, but you're going to have a lot of resolution out of that.
Well, that's true. And then there's the other area, Todd, is repair and replacement of equipment. So we know for a fact that a lot of the damage in hospitals, and much of my career I was doing contracting for services, again, for major endoscopy companies.
Sure.
And so I know for a fact that hospitals spend exorbitant amounts of money fixing equipment. You could have a hospital with just one device called a ureteroscope. Okay, it's a very thin scope. It's used to go up the ureter to look inside the kidney to do lysis of kidney stones, to do diagnosis for cancer and other procedures inside the kidney. That one instrument sells for about $15,000 to $20,000 a piece.
Yeah.
They break very frequently, and we know that a lot of damage occurs to them just through mishandling in the sterile processing department. Again, because we've got everybody taking their turn, whether the person's been there for months or they've been there for 2 weeks, they get their turn at cleaning these very delicate instruments. And when you have a lot of instruments that look very heavy duty, these big stainless steel instruments, things that you can kind of move around and get banged around, the people think, well, it's steel, it's okay, it's not going to cause any damage.
They assume it's more durable than it is.
They may assume it's more durable, and they cause damage, and the repair of one of those is about a $10,000. It could be anywhere from, say, $3,500 to $10,000 to fix one of those scopes alone. Hospitals, you know, a big teaching hospital could spend $300,000 to $400,000 just on that one item, and they may only have 10 or 12 of those in their whole inventory. It's a major expense. Rigid scopes, camera equipment, and even just stainless steel. It's an education of how to properly handle. I mean, I've witnessed sterile processing staff take very delicate eye instruments and process after they wash them. They were pretty rough with them in the sink washing them, and you got these little delicate scissors that are, you know, cutting on the eye. Taking them and banging them on the side of the sink to get the water off them at the end. I mean, if you have somebody who's uneducated about the instrumentation, you can do a lot of damage, and hospitals will spend literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year in repair of equipment that probably 50 to 70% of it could be avoided.
With just proper training?
Through better training and education of their staff. But the problem is in sterile processing, back to the original epidemic, people that are paid, you know, $12, $13 an hour, maybe they max out at like $22 an hour. So, you know, they're in low 40 range. Lots of turnover. So you can have, you know, you could have hospitals that have, you know, 20%, 30%, 40% turnover in a year in their staff, and then they've got to start over and start to train them again.
You've got that brain drain.
Drain. The tenure of the people, the knowledge of the people, and all those people who are handling all this equipment leads to damage. So there's major expense with that. Then also, if they're not processing it properly, they're not cleaning it properly, and we leave behind any kind of bioburden, you again increase risk of surgical site infections for the patient. So some people think, well, if you put it in a sterilizer, sterilizer kills everything, right? Well, no. By definition,
if it did, you wouldn't have the problem.
If it's not clean, yeah, exactly. It's like nobody would go into a restaurant and pick a fork up that still had egg yolk hardened on it and say, I'm going to just use this because it went through the sterilizer back in the back, right?
Yeah, I would not.
No. And you wouldn't want that instrument, if it was a scissor, having blood or debris from a previous patient be used on you during your procedure.
Absolutely. So with this being a silent epidemic, as you're saying, so like what can a company do or a hospital do if they're having this problem with their SPD or with their surgical centers?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to recognize that the root cause of this issue, like a lot of hospitals will try to, the sterile processing department will treat symptoms.
Yeah.
Like they'll say, okay, we got high turnover, you know, we need to recruit better, we need to maybe bump our pay a little bit, right?
Sure.
That still doesn't solve the root cause of the problem.
Right.
If they say, well, we got surgeon frustration, you know, we're really going to focus, we'll have an educator come in and really focus on this piece, that one piece, I mean, while those are good efforts, it's really addressing the symptoms of the problem and not the root cause. So I think hospitals are well advised to, you know, reach out and talk to companies, you know, such as ours. Other companies are out there as well that could come in and do consultations with them to really look for root cause of problems. The genesis, I think, is the fact that, you know, we know that without specialization, by not dividing your your workforce, so to speak, within the hospital between complex and general instruments. And even small hospitals, I think, some people say, well, we only have 4 ORs, we got 5 people working here, how are we going to specialize?
Yeah.
What it really means is that you really need to have everybody be in that hospital a specialist, and look at pay and recognition and morale building and communications
and employee
between
retention
OR and
even.
SPs.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because
yeah.
without that in a small hospital, if you have a high turnover in a small hospital, it's even worse because you don't really have the opportunity to specialize. Everybody really has to handle everything, but you really need more of that team approach between the OR and SPD, and that's a critical piece. So I think looking at the root cause of the problems is the number one thing. Identifying places where specialization can occur to really provide a career opportunity for staff so that they can move in. And many hospitals, you come in the sterile process, you can get annual increases, but there's no designation between a person started yesterday and a person's been there for 5 years or 10 years. So, nobody wants to work in that kind of environment. So I think basically SPD needs to come up into today's world. SPD is a mass manufacturing area, okay? The way it's being run in a lot of hospitals today, it's being run like it's more of a cottage industry.
Right.
So because in essence, the result, the end product that shows up in the operating room is the result of the one person who touched it. Many hospitals don't even have an extra person QC product.
QCB, quality control. Okay.
Yeah, like where the person who, packages the equipment and sterilizes it, the one who pulls it to put it on the shelf and cart. So there's nobody like double checking. There's not even a process for double checks periodically, like random. So it's not really. So the only way they know that something didn't go right is when the operating room hollers down and says something's wrong with this. You guys didn't do this right, and it can be really bad. I mean, there's patients that'll go in and be under anesthesia. Well, they've got to cancel cases because the instrumentation, they open it up and they find that there's bioburden on an instrument.
Yeah.
And they don't have another set. You got a patient asleep, and now the surgeon's in a position where can't do the procedure. You got a patient who's undergone anesthesia. You got a family that's waiting to hear what's going on.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the surgeon's got to go out and tell them, we had to cancel the case.
Yeah.
I just heard of a case that happened the day before yesterday. A lot of that won't show up on the front page of the newspaper.
Sure.
But it happens in hospitals, and if you talk to the people, that's why I call it kind of a silent epidemic, because it happens in hospitals across the country. And quite frankly, it's an area that I think that if hospital administration focused on it more, if they recognize the root cause of those problems, it could be addressed, and they would save money holistically through less damage, less repair replacement, less replacement of lost instruments. That's another huge problem in hospitals. All these other sundry problems, delayed operating room times, the cost of operating room, or just the fact that, if I'm delaying this case, it means I can't do another case. I can't bring revenue in from another case. So there's a whole revenue side of this as well for
It's a whole compounding issue.
Yeah, you cannot look at this as being one single problem and it's going to fix this and all the problems go away. It's a problem that's really interrelated. And again, when you look at the root cause, it's a basically recognition of the value and importance of sterile processing by the hospital administration, and allowing sterile processing to specialize to some degree like the operating room has, so that you're sure that you got your best people on the most complex devices. Because when you don't do that, if you could just graph this out, you'd see like an average, person's really good, you're A player, you're C player, well, the best you're going to be is a B, right? So to the operating room, you're a B. You're never going to be an A, you're never going to be a C, you're going to be a B because you're average. That's the problem in the hospital. So you've got to figure out a way to keep your A team on the complex stuff, let your B team be on the stuff that's less complex, and then that way you're more sure that you're going to have better
and
product.
then train up to be on the A team.
Absolutely, and give people opportunity for advancement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Greg, this is a conversation we're going to have to continue many, many times, because there's so much more I'd love to get into, but we just sort of run out of time. But thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Todd.
Absolutely.
Thank you.